Hello, everyone. Britain is bankrupt. Yes, the government is pretty much bust. And although this week there is what's called a spending review by the Chancellor called Rachel Reeves, I can't believe that this person who is so incompetent is the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the once great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But this government, like successive governments, has presided over more gross financial mismanagement, and it's getting worse with every week. Now, we keep on hearing from this Labour government and the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, that there is a £22 billion black hole. Well, this is complete nonsense, because actually the black hole that we have is over 100 times bigger than 22 billion. Is actually 2,800 billion, or 2.8 trillion. That's the black hole that we have in the United Kingdom, which is our national debt. And in fact, that black hole is increasing by over 5 times the amount of the so-called 22 billion every year, because the budget deficit is now 153 billion pounds per year. Not just 22 billion in total, it's going up by 153 billion pounds per year on top of the 2.8 trillion pounds national debt. So no wonder the price of everything in the shops for ordinary people is going up and up and up, because the amount of currency units we've got, the amount of pounds that are in circulation, is directly proportional to the amount of national debt that we have, because money is actually created. It's an illusion in the system we have, and the fiat currency system we have, which is not based on anything real like gold or silver or other commodities. It's an illusion, but it carries on because most people have confidence in it, that if I show you a pound note or a £10 note like the one behind me here, that someone will take that in exchange for goods or services. So while people believe that, the fiat currency system continues. But the amount that each of these notes is worth, a £10 note, £20 note, etc., is debased every year because of the budget deficit, because the number of currency units, the number of pounds increases. If it increases by 2%, then there's 2% inflation. If it increases by 25%, which is what happened in the COVID era with the furlough and the lockdown and everything, and and all these loans that were given out, and all this gross financial mismanagement of spending hundreds of billions on injections and things like that. Well, of course, the national debt went up by about 25% just in a couple of years. So it's not surprising that prices went up by the same amount with a lag of 12 to 18 months. So by the end of 2023, everything cost at least half as much again as it did in 2020. Sometimes prices are doubled. I mean, you go into a supermarket now, it costs £2 for a can of baked beans, for goodness sake. This is absolutely ridiculous, and it's going to go up more if the budget deficit continues at the level it is, and if the national debt continues to go up. So what they're doing, however, is just adding fuel to the fire, if you like, by being incredibly stupid. Well, I don't think it's stupidity, it's deliberate. They're deliberately throwing money out the door at things that they know has no value whatsoever, is actually detrimental to the nation, to our environment, to our peace and security, and so on. But they're spaffing money out all the time on Ukraine, for example. £3 billion per year ad infinitum. They've made this 100-year deal with Ukraine, and that is just the same amount of money that they're getting from inheritance tax on farmers, from VAT on private schools, which is decimating farmers and private schools, and the winter fuel allowance, just in one. All those three things which have caused so much trouble to so many people in the country, and they're spaffing it all out the door, straight out the door on Ukraine, while hammering farmers and private schools and pensioners. They're only getting a little bit of money from that, 3 or 4 billion in total. So you can see how they are hammering British people, and not just a few. Millions and millions of British people are getting hammered to get a tiny little amount of money, and then they're giving it straight away to Zelensky and the Ukrainian army to kill Russians, which is absolutely deplorable of the Starmer regime and everybody in the Labour government. And if you support them, then you are pretty much deplorable, or you are supporting something that's deplorable. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. £3 billion a year on Ukraine. There's £6 billion a year at least going on migrant hotels, because they're facilitating replacement migration. Tens of thousands of military-age men a year coming across the channel and being put up in luxury hotels for a few months, maybe a few years, before they're shipped out to local authorities around the council. And when they get to local authorities, combined, foreign nationals are getting £12 billion a year in benefits. And that's not including the migrant hotels, and that's not including healthcare and dentistry and education costs and English language programs for people who can't speak English and shouldn't be in the country anyway, and things like that. So there's a load more being spent on them. But that is only a small amount compared to the amount that they're wasting on net zero, this crazy climate alarmist ideology, where they are spending, who knows, 30 billion plus a year on subsidies for wind turbines that don't produce any energy when the wind stops blowing, and solar panels, which are ruining huge swathes of prime agricultural land all across the country, changing the land use from growing food, which we need to eat, to putting up solar panels, which again don't provide hardly any energy when the sun stops shining, and need 100% backup from carbon-based fuels or hydro or nuclear, or importing energy from Norway and France and the Netherlands when we don't produce enough of our own, because the idiots in government, well, they're not idiots, this is deliberate creation of scarcity. These nefarious people in government are insisting that we change to solar and wind, which is never going to provide enough energy for us continuously all the time. So we're going to have power cuts, and we're paying £30 billion a year plus for the privilege. And on top of that, they are spending £12 billion for so-called carbon capture and storage, which is, what is that? Trying to take carbon dioxide out of the air and stick it in the ground. Even a child can tell you this is complete idiocy scientifically. And carbon dioxide is not a harmful demonic gas. Plants love it. Plants use carbon dioxide to grow. It's food for plants. And in horticulture, in all these greenhouses around, where we still do grow some things in our country, they increase the levels of carbon dioxide by 2 or 3 times what it is in the atmosphere. So plants grow quicker, they make more fruit, more vegetables, and they're bigger and juicier and tastier because of elevated levels of carbon dioxide. And this crazy ideology that says we need to spend tens or hundreds of billions of pounds, euros and dollars on removing carbon dioxide from the air when plants just absorb it and turn it into food, it is absolutely ridiculous. And we're paying for our own destruction and scarcity coming in. So that's one of the biggest things, not to mention, of course, another £12 billion that they're spending to on climate alarmism, on net zero projects overseas. We shouldn't be spending any money overseas, giving money to people who are going to make some money and pocket money for sticking up wind turbines and ruining Africa and ruining South America, as well as ruining our own country. But this isn't going to make any difference whatsoever to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when the UK only produces 1% of global carbon dioxide, and China produces 30% of global carbon dioxide emissions because they're building carbon-based energy power plants, particularly coal, all over the place to fund their industry. So they're increasing their carbon dioxide emissions like there's no tomorrow. So is India, so is a lot of the developing world, whereas the UK has got these crazy people in government that seem to think that we need to reduce it, and they're going to pay huge amounts of money on that. And they're only going to get the money from borrowing it on the markets, either from the Bank of England or other big commercial banks or pension funds who buy government gilts, which is essentially a bond. It's a debt. They pay interest on it, and then they pay the capital back after 10 years or 30 years or 2 years, whatever the term of the debt is. But we know that the bond market is freezing up because just recently the USA couldn't sell all of its bonds. Japan, the Japanese government, had a bond auction. They couldn't sell all of their government bonds. There was no interest in buying long-term US Treasury bonds and Japanese government bonds. And when the UK government is going to come up to sell more bonds to supposedly pay for all the idiocy that the Labour government is doing, there's going to come a point where people are going to say, the banks and investors in government bonds are just going to say, we're not interested, we're not buying any more of your bonds because your national debt is too high, and we don't trust that you're going to be able to pay it back. And when people stop trusting that a government will be able to pay the interest on their bonds or pay back the capital at the end, that's when there's a freeze. The government can't raise any more debt. And then it's game over in terms of borrowing money to spend more. So then the only thing the government can do is tax people more. They've already increased taxes all over the place, particularly on businesses, with employers, national insurance. And they've got, obviously, this VAT on private schools. They're taxing farmers, as I've said before, with inheritance tax. Council tax for everybody has gone through the roof. And that's extra to your income tax and national insurance. Everyone is pursued by local councils to pay under threat of being taken to court and having the bailiffs round your house if you don't pay. I know people have got different opinions on what to do about that, but I'm not going to go into that here. But obviously, that's just another part of taxation on people, and that's already gone through the roof, so much so that, of course, with the Laffer curve, if you increase tax too much, you get less. You get less tax because the wealthy people just leave the country and they move their money in a nanosecond to Switzerland or Singapore or Bermuda or something. So if the government taxes too much, if they increase taxes too much, they get less. So there's nothing they can really do. The only thing that they can do, which would be sensible, would be to cut spending drastically on all of these things that they're wasting money on. Migrant hotels, diversity officers, HS2, net zero, wind turbines, solar panels. I don't call them solar farms anymore because they're not farms. They're actually destroying farms. Maybe you should call them solar farm destroyers, rather than solar farms. Calling them solar farms is a bit of a psychological trick to get you to think, oh, it's nice. Solar panels all over the countryside. They're nice. They're farms. They're not farms. They're wrecking farms. Farms grow food. Solar panels are arrays of death, and they're not farms at all. But we need to stop spending money on that because it's a complete waste, a complete sham. And the only people who benefit are the people who get the contracts, the government's mates who get the contracts for procurement and all of these things. Like Serco, they get a lot of money for housing migrants in hotels, but also in the private rented sector. And they're trying to get 5-year deals on houses all over the place. The government's paying for it. Well, except taxpayers are paying for it. And then they're pricing British people out of being able to rent their own home in the private rented sector because the government is spending billions of pounds paying Serco to get contracts to rent homes in the private rental sector, to give them out to migrants so that British people can't rent a home. And so the whole thing is just completely disastrous for our own people, and it's a huge waste of money, which is causing the country to go bankrupt and bust even quicker than it would do otherwise. The only silver lining with this is that may stop crazy Angela Rayner's plans to build 1.5 million homes all across the countryside, decimating the English countryside with these plans for homes, 7 out of 10 of which are going to go to asylum seekers and migrants because of the mass rapid replacement migration which is going on. So there's this spending review coming up this week, and every department wants more money. The education department wants more money. The police want more money. The military want more money. There was the strategic defense review last week where Keir Starmer said, we're going to increase spending on defense from 2.3% of GDP to 3.5%, maybe even 5% of GDP. That's what Pete Hesketh, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State for Defense in the USA, is demanding Britain does, that we increase spending to 5% of GDP, which would be another 30 billion pounds or more a year on defense. Well, this is just isn't going to happen with all the other demands on the public purse, because Labour wants to spend, and usually on their mates, spend more on benefits, spend more on net zero, spend more on migrants, spend more on overseas aid or development, whatever that means. It just means wasting money. It means poor people in this country subsidizing wealthy people in developing countries who pocket the overseas development money. And this is what successive governments have done. Tory, Labour, it doesn't matter. They all do the same thing. It's just Labour does it a little bit faster and a little bit harder and a little bit quicker, but there's no difference between Tory and Labour, or even Reform, who are actually just trying to get headlines every day, and said last week that they would lift the 2-child cap on universal credit, which would essentially mean large migrant families would receive billions of pounds more from the government in benefits. So you can't even trust Reform to be financially responsible. The one party you can trust is the Heritage Party, and we've set out our principle to be financially responsible in government from the very beginning. When the Heritage Party started in 2020, it's been in our manifesto, and I'm updating our manifesto at the moment in the light of changes in politics that have taken place over the last year with the Labour government coming in to being. But we have very clear principles in our manifesto. Essentially, we need to reduce spending drastically by more than the budget deficit. So we have a budget deficit of 153 billion. We need to reduce spending by more than that so that the budget deficit goes down to zero and we're not increasing our national debt. At least that way, the inflation stops, the value of the pound stops going down, and the purchasing power of the pound in your pocket at least remains the same and doesn't get eroded over time by inflation, which is what happens to good people, the people who do what they're told: save, work hard, save money, and you'll be all right. But that's not what happens, because the government keeps on increasing debt year after year after year. So the value of your pounds in your pocket and your bank account keep getting eroded because we increase the national debt. Well, we need to decrease the national debt to zero, stop borrowing more money, and then anything over that we can reduce spending by should go into tax cuts, and in particularly to reverse these dreadful things that the Labour government has done, taxing farmers with inheritance tax, taxing private schools, which is destroying private schools. We can give back the winter fuel allowance to pensioners who've paid into the system all of their lives and deserve, a little bit of a few hundred quid in the winter to help them with fuel bills. But fuel bills shouldn't be high anyway. And with abandoning net zero, then winter fuel payments would not be necessary because the price of energy will go down by a greater amount than £300. So no one will need it anyway. That's another way of solving the problem there. And of course, ultimately, we want to get rid of inheritance tax, reduce corporation tax, and increase the shared marriage allowance up to 100% so that married couples with children can share their marriage allowance for income tax and national insurance. And that makes it easier for a mother to stay home and look after children and have children, which ultimately leads into the end of the population decline of the indigenous population of this country, which is what some people are using as an excuse to say, oh, we need replacement migration because the indigenous population is decreasing. Well, that's just the wrong way to look at it. So financial responsibility will feed into families being able to sustain themselves and look after themselves as well. So it's all good. So we need to reduce spending, reduce borrowing, and reduce taxation. But most of the other parties, what they say is we're going to increase spending, and then they will have to increase borrowing and taxation, which just isn't going to happen because we're coming to the bond apocalypse very soon, where the government is not going to be able to borrow any more money, and then taxation isn't going to raise any more money. So they will have to cut spending anyway. Essentially at that point, that will be worse than doing nothing, because what's the first thing that will happen? Well, the whole welfare system will just crash. Welfare and state pensions, they will just go. They will have to, because if the government can't raise more money and they're still spending huge amounts of money on rubbish, then the benefit system, there won't be any benefits. That's £350 billion a year on benefits and state pensions. That will be the first thing to go if there is a bond apocalypse coming up, which will happen if a government doesn't voluntarily cut spending and start to be financially responsible. And that's what we have to do. And only the Heritage Party is looking at this, and will do it. And we will cut spending and cut borrowing and cut taxation as well. If we don't, the country is going bust. It is going bankrupt. It will go bankrupt unless people listen to our principles and enact them. I don't trust that any of the other parties do. So please do come and join me to campaign for financial responsibility in government so that we can continue to exist as a nation with the way of life that we like. Thanks for listening, everyone. God bless you all.